The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Devin Grant. I'm the Director of the Governor's Cabinet and Advisory Committee for People with Disabilities and one of the co-leaders for our Pennsylvania Employment First State Leadership Mentoring Program. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. I do need to apologize for the automatic notice that went out. I guess there was a mix-up. You may have noticed that it talked about SSI and last year's dates. So somehow last year's notice got tied into today's notice. So I apologize if that confused you. Today is part one of our three-part series on best practices in rural areas. And a couple of housekeeping items before we jump into it. If you have trouble with the audio connection, it does seem to connect better if you're using your telephone rather than computer speakers. So if you're having that trouble, maybe try switching over and that might clear it up. If that doesn't work, maybe try completely reconnecting. Sometimes that'll clear it up as well. We will have a time for questions about halfway through and then again at the end. So if you have questions, please type those into the question box and I'll read those to Tom and he can answer those at those times. Our subject matter expert and presenter today is Tom Wilds. He's one of the national subject matter experts for this project, and I will let him introduce himself. So with that, turn it over to you, Tom.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Why is my thing not moving suddenly? I'm having a hard time, Devin, with this slide. There you go.
There you go.
It took a while to think through.
It fell asleep.
Okay. Well, I've got, there you go. Okay. Well, good afternoon. I'm Tom Wilds. I've been in the field now. This is my 50th year. I started as a psych aide at a state hospital, worked my way up to teacher aide, special ed teacher, voc rehab teacher, became a trainer during the 70s for the integration of Head Start and worked on a couple federal grants for the integration of kids with disabilities for Public Law 94-142. After that, I became the president and CEO for 33 years of St. John's Community Services, which is a historic nonprofit with the home office in Washington, D.C. We grew the agency to provide services in 5 states. And we actually began the process in the late 1980s to be totally integrated, community-based, and an employment program where we were totally building free well before most other agencies in the country had even thought about it. And because of that, when I retired, and also some of my staff when we left together, a bunch of us were recruited to be SMEs for the Department of Labor, and I've also been an SME for the Department of Justice. So with that, today we're going to talk about rural transformation. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is really from a CEO's perspective. In the next session, Dwayne Webb, who is still with St. John's Community Services, is going to talk more about how individual people were integrated into the community. So, some of this might be redundant for people the audience who have been involved in the transformation process, but I always like to make sure that we're all grounded of what is it that we're actually trying to do and how are we approaching the transformation process. So I'm going to talk about the forces for change and what is our resulting goal for all of us as providers, how we approach the assessment process. If any of you have been selected to go through the formal provider transformation process, there's an assessment instrument we use. So I'm going to walk through that using Martin, Tennessee, an agency that St. John's merged with, as an example of the assessment process in a rural area. And then I'm going to talk about how we planned the transformation and what was the result in this pretty rural area. The three really major driving forces here for transformation, as you all know, is the waiver setting rule, the Employment First initiative, and WIOA. For the settings rule, in the future, by 2022, all home and community-based settings must meet certain qualifications. And one of the primary things is the setting is really integrated in and supports full access to the greater community. And, this is a major challenge for a lot of organizations, regardless if it's rural or, urban or suburban. People are having a difficulty trying to just figure out how they're going to accomplish that. That services are selected by the individual among settings options, ensures rights of privacy, dignity, respect, and freedom from coercion and restraint, optimizes autonomy and independence in making life choices, and facilitates choices regarding services and who provides them. What they exclude, and what I've found as being an SME in over 10 states now, is that a lot of our programs throughout the country are really a lot like institutional in nature. They have the effect of isolating individuals receiving Medicaid-funded waiver services from the broader community of individuals not receiving Medicaid-funded services. So, the question is, how do we get people to really be part of the community, and what is that process? And how do we transform an agency that is really facility-based? With Employment First, a lot of people have, providers have sheltered workshops or segregated or some kind of enclave that employers pay the provider and they then pay the participants. But Employment First, what we're really striving for is where employment is paid directly by employers at the greater minimum wage or prevailing wages with related health and employment benefits occurring in a typical work setting where the employee with a disability interacts or has the opportunity to interact continuously with non-disabled workers, has the opportunity for advancement and mobility, and is preferably engaged with them. Consistent with the settings rule, such services should be infused with the broader goal of ensuring that youth and adults with disabilities are meaningfully engaged in the community and have access to individual supports required for full participation. With WIOA, I'll just briefly go through this and not read it all to you. But it's really about the coordination of VR and other agencies, that the initial time period for VR supported services has been increased from 18 to 24 months. That it targeted at people with some of the most significant disabilities. Individuals with disabilities 24 and younger must be provided with various services designed to improve their access to competitive integrated employment, including transition service, vocational, career counseling, before they are employed at a sub-minimum wage. So we're really trying to discourage people going directly into workshop type settings where there's sub-minimum wage. And that no employee could be paid a sub-minimum wage unless ticket holders are prohibited from paying sub-minimum wage to any individual with a disability, regardless of age, unless the provider provides him or her with career counseling, information referrals. The employer provides information about local self-advocacy, self-determination, and peer mentoring training opportunities, and to do so at least every 6 months and then annually thereafter. So you put those three initiatives, regulations together, and the goal for all providers at this moment in our evolution of services is to provide competitive integrated employment with community integrated engagement. So that's what we're striving for, regardless if it's rural or big city provider. So we're going to talk about Martin, Tennessee, where St. John's really had an interesting experience. We're going to talk about the assessment of the employment first assets and deficits, developing the plan, and the implementation and outcomes, at least for the first 2 years of the transformation process. So this is Tennessee. And if you look to the west, to the left side of your page, in that, I think that's called Teal, where Weakley, Henry County is, that's pretty much where Martin, Tennessee is located. It's right on the border of Kentucky, and it's pretty much halfway between Memphis and Nashville. This is a little picture of the downtown area. It's just a couple blocks long, very rural. It has a university there on the outside of town. The program that we began to merge with, this is their day and office building. It was a traditional day program where, I don't know, maybe 50, 70 people came from 6 counties, often driven 50 miles one way to spend the day. And a lot of people were considered medically fragile, behavior issues. They really didn't want to go out into the community at all. And outside of town, on the other side of town, they had a sheltered workshop. Had a big delivery truck and a couple vans, and another 70 or so people spent their day in this building. On the left side is a big sheltered workshop, doing maybe about 6 different types of contracts during the day. They also had 5 group homes, and they were rather large. 10, maybe 12 people in some of the homes. Most of them were in rural areas where there was really no possibility for community interaction. they couldn't walk to the store, they really couldn't walk to the job or any kind of recreational activities. They were, for the most part, pretty remote and large. So it was fairly institutional in nature. So with all of the technical assistance that SMEs provide through ODEP, we look at these various areas to do an assessment. Leadership, strategic planning, customer focus, workforce focus, operations, measurement and analysis, and results. So these are the 7 different areas that we would do an assessment before we began planning for the transformation change of trying to do competitive integrated employment and integrated community engagement. So with this agency, and it was really in trouble, and the state requested us to provide, St. John's, to provide technical assistance. The agency was really failing, both programmatically and financially, and they were missing payrolls and quite a number of challenges that they just no longer could operate. So we went and did a site visit and discovered pretty much of what I just showed you. We did a tour. We met with the agency board. They had about 10 board members who were community leaders, had been on the board for quite a while. Some were associated with the university. Some were development people, a couple politicians from the local area. And we decided what we would do is initially engage in a management agreement. St. John's had a really experienced corporate attorney who helped draw it up, where we were going to take over the management of the agency and try to turn it around both financially and programmatically within, I think the original one was about a year. And during that time, we were going to discover a lot more about the agency. We were going to do due diligence. We were going to look at, their financials in depth and the qualifications of their staff and what waiver codes they were using and that sort of thing, and to see just how we could turn the agency around to achieve the employment first goals. And we were going to do that through the assessment process that ODEP has. At this time, we didn't have the luxury of outline that ODEP has provided, but we essentially engaged in a similar process. So I'm going to walk you through that. So the first part of the assessment is leadership. And what we discovered in terms of assets was that this was a historic community agency. It was one of the very few agencies in this area, and everyone in the community knew and loved it and respected it because they took care of the people with intellectual disabilities, and there was a good number of folks attending the agency, and parents really supported it. The board of directors, as I said, was comprised of recognized community leaders, so it really had a good reputation. And the board was very supportive of us intervening and helping them achieve a change, especially if it meant survival for this agency. The deficits were that management was pretty much absent, that the CEO and the assistant had both been ill for an extended period of time, and the agency was pretty much on automatic pilot. They were under fire for letting the community down. That there was a radio station, and I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up, but the radio station owner realized that the agency was failing and that they weren't paying their bills and they weren't paying their staff and they were in deep trouble. And he often talked about them on the radio, that this distinguished board should really be doing more. And they had no communication plan. It was just a vacuum. No one in the community really knew what was going on, why it was failing. It just knew that it was. For strategic planning, the board really wanted plans, and the state, who asked us to intervene in this relationship, wanted us to come in and save this agency, save its heritage, and really bring it up to today's standards of meeting Employment First initiative. And the community really supported it. It really wanted it to do better, but just didn't have any information about why it was failing. The agency, in terms of deficits, had been accumulating debt. They had a fleet of buses and vans that some repair shops were trying to help them out, but they owed a little bit of everybody some money. Staff hadn't been paid for months at a time. Brakes on vans that were driving 50 miles one way to pick people up weren't being addressed. Oil changes weren't being had. Just a lot of bad things were going on. And they had no expertise within the agency to really work their way out of the situation. There was no strategic plan, and there was no planning expertise on the board. In terms of customer focus, long-term program adult participants, people who had been there 10 plus years, this was their program, and they, this is where their friends were, this is where they came. If they didn't come here, they really wouldn't be anywhere except just sitting at home. Parents and participants wanted and needed the program. For the deficits, participants were traveling across 5-6 counties to a central location where participants wanted to be with their friends. It's all they knew. They really weren't interested in work or in community participation. They didn't know how to figure that out. It was a very small community, and the staff just thought, a field trip now and then to the local circus, or if the downtown was having a fair of some sort, that was what they call community integration. Some participants were earning workshop income, and that was going to be an issue over the long haul in terms of converting the agency to competitive integrated employment or to community engagement, that no one really wanted to lose, even if it was a couple dollars a week, no one wanted to lose that income. And parents and staff, voiced their concern the minute we walked in the door about these people really can't go out into the community because of medical, behavioral, or intellectual needs that the participants had, that there was no opportunities in the community that could really address those needs. So for the workforce, there was long-term staff. They really had been there, and even when they weren't paid for months at a time, staff kept showing up. They just could not walk away from the participants in their program. They had really strong relationships and cared about them. So the staff were dedicated, and they were very connected to the community. The deficits for the staff were they weren't paid routinely. Benefits were non-existent. They cut hours. I think it was like 29 hours as most anybody could work, so that they wouldn't pay benefits. But what was happening is then they were all working overtime. It wasn't scheduled, but it was overtime because they really didn't have enough staff. So particularly with the transportation, the program staff were doing all of the transportation, and it was just killing them financially. And staff, even though the folks loved the participants and wouldn't fail to show up for them, the staff felt pretty beat up. Morale was really low. There wasn't any leadership. There wasn't any plan. People weren't getting paid. They just didn't know what to do. There were no HR policies and procedures. The job descriptions for staff were center-based and really outdated. Salary scales were non-existent. What was happening is where people, where there were vacancies and they were hiring some folk, newer staff would be paid more than some of the older staff, or some of the new staff were getting their job developer was given a car, and no one could understand why that was happening when resources were so minimal. How could one staff person get more through the deficit of the rest of the staff? For operations, there was, I guess, total overall 115 people. And earlier when I said there was like 70 people here and 70 people there, a lot of these people crossed over. They would be in the day program, like half the time, and then they'd go over to the workshop another part of the time. The 5 group homes had 8 to 10 residents each, and they were different functioning levels. It was fairly chaotic and with very minimal supervision out, really in farm country in most cases, where they couldn't interact with the community at large. The day building and the administrative building was really owned by the government, and they were providing the building, not the utilities, but the building without charge. So that was of some benefit. And the agency owned the sheltered workshop and 4 out of 5 of the homes. The 5th home they were leasing. And these were HUD homes. These weren't waiver homes. So it made it a little more complicated in terms of downsizing, because HUD really didn't want to downsize. We really had some major challenges working with HUD to convert these homes to waiver. For the assets for operation, despite all this going on, it still had a good reputation of providing a very needed service. It was near a university, though really no university assets were being used. There was very little relationship with the university. There was a couple board members that was connected to the university, and that was really it. That education, recreation, volunteer, and employment opportunities were really scattered throughout the 6 counties that they were serving. And as you can imagine by looking at the slides of downtown Martin, Tennessee, there really wasn't a lot of opportunities consolidated in that small town. For operations, it was losing money. There was no cash reserves or line of credit, and there was no community-based day services. The further deficits that overtime was really high, people working double shifts, vehicles were in disrepair, no maintenance program, owed a lot to the local repair shops and causing some communication throughout the town of that this was a failing organization, that we were transporting participants from all over, the counties, and it was expensive and it was really dangerous. People with pretty challenging behaviors and intellectual disabilities, riding with one staff person through the snow, through some pretty intense storms in that region. So it wasn't really good. There were no operations policy procedures. It was pretty much, the day program was pretty much a daycare of doing arts and crafts and that kind of stuff without really any goals of helping somebody to have real life skills that could lead to independence. That education, recreation were not centralized in the community, so this being so dispersed, the staff couldn't figure out how to do community engagement for their participants. And the recession at that time caused several businesses, several factories to close, and just general unemployment was pretty high. They had a workshop using sub-minimum wage certificate. Participants would voice their concern that they really did want to be engaged in the community. They were kind of in a double bind. They wanted to be with their friends, but they also wanted to experience the community. Once a year in Kentucky, there was a concert that lasted, like a festival that lasted for a weekend. And the program participants would be looking forward to this, and pretty much only this, all year to go to this concert. Job development, while at one time was had a good reputation, it was really ineffective. That no current placements were going on, or even not effectively looking for employment. So when we get to looking at data and how do we use data in all of these different areas, both financial and programmatically and HR, there really wasn't any. That we could not draw any conclusion from observation because there just wasn't any. They didn't even have a budget. that just really took us out. That there was no budget, there was no routine financials, that they spent more money than what was coming in. They did no surveys of the participants, the staff, the community. The only review process was by the state. They weren't CAR certified. They had no internal quality assurance. So the state would come in and monitor for Medicaid funding and pretty much beat them up every time they came, and they would scramble to come up with program documentation to save the little bit of funding that they had. And really, in terms of looking at results and the final part of the asset portion of the assessment, is it was the only game in town. And so everybody wanted it to survive, but we had little to nothing to work with. There was no data to assess status, and the agency was failing financially and in best practices. So at that point, that's an overview of the predicament we faced, and we had a mission of trying to save this agency. So why don't we just take a minute to see if there's any questions. Anybody have anything, Kevin?
Yeah, there's been a couple, and I've tried to answer them there in the questions box. But if you didn't have a chance to see those, a couple of them had more to do with logistics in terms of whether the PowerPoint's available. And I commented I will send it out to everybody on the line when I send out the evaluation, probably in the next day or two. But the one question that maybe you can answer quick, I also sent a link to this for this question, but you can maybe add a comment or two as well. They asked, can the disabled employee lose benefits by participating in a paid employment opportunity? And I provided the link for the recordings of our previous webinars, because last year we did have a couple webinars specifically on that topic. So there was some pretty good detailed discussions there, but maybe if you can add a couple comments right now too.
Yeah, well, two things. One is, through WIOLA and Voc Rehab, there is benefits counseling that is made available. So if somebody is referred to Voc Rehab, they can get a benefits counselor to help sort it out for those parents and providers who have some anxiety about losing their benefits. But the one new piece of legislation that has come out, about a year and a half ago now, is the ABLE accounts, where a employee with a disability who meets the test, has a doctor's note and that sort of thing, can set aside their income to pay for a lot of life's essentials, like housing, transportation, medical needs, pretty much everything you need to live. You can set aside all or a portion of your money. There are some caps, but it's fairly high. I don't remember the caps off the top of my head. But if you go, I think it's able.com, and every state that are participating have developed their individual website. And if your state has not gotten to the point to come up with its own procedures, you can actually participate in a neighboring state's able accounts. The only, I guess, challenge there is when you put your money into an able account, it defers that money from both state and federal taxes also, in addition to sheltering it from being counted towards your benefits. But if you put it in to a neighboring state's account, because your state may not have it yet, that you have to pay state taxes. But it still shelters it from federal and from being held against your Social Security benefits. So it, I think things have changed a lot in the last just a couple of years, to where I don't think people really should have that fear that Conklin is available to help guide you through the process. And now with the ABLE accounts, you're pretty protected. So I don't think we should have those kind of fears anymore.
Yeah, Tom, we do have the ABLE account set up here in Pennsylvania, and it's through our Department of Treasury. And there's, I guess, a consortium of a few different states to make the pot bigger for investment purposes. So it is up and running, and I'm trying to pull the link up here. It's
but I did.
It's paable.gov is our website.
Yeah, great. So I would go there, and it's stunning. I mean, this is a major game changer for people with disabilities who were fearful that going to work would, harm their benefits. Okie doke. Ready to move on?
I think one more just popped in. What kind of involvement did the community want with the participants on the workshop?
The community really didn't know. They were supportive in a variety of ways. The community would host a couple fundraisers now and then. There was, I forget what you call it, but it was a motorcycle ride in this rural community that raised maybe about $10,000 annually, and they would get a Harley Davidson motorcycle donated to, some, I don't know how the game worked, but people would ride around to different locations, and whoever won this game won a motorcycle. So a lot of motorcycle enthusiastic folk would participate, and they raised a lot of money. I don't think that the community was really tapped in any way prior to St. John's coming. It was very discouraging, to say the least. St. John's, for those of you who don't know much about that organization, it is the Church of the Presidents. If you have watched any of the inaugurations, be it Bush or Obama or Trump, it always starts at St. John's Church. St. John's is one of the oldest charities in the country. It was founded in 1868 originally as a Civil War hospital, morphed into an orphanage, and then became one of the first alternatives to the state institution. I became the director in 1980, and it was a failing little 10-month day school for children with intellectual disabilities. And over time, I was there 33 years, we grew it to provide services in 5 states. And we converted it from a center base to totally community based. And so, we were fairly progressive by the time we got to Martin, Tennessee. And we had been throughout Tennessee, in Jackson and Memphis, and we were in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and Northern Virginia and DC and New Jersey and stuff. So we had a lot of experience, but when we got to Martin, it was really sad that it was a collection of buildings and people really not doing much of anything progressive, and the community was intact. And a lot of that was really because the leadership was absent. And it really wasn't any fault of their own. The leadership was sick. And the board didn't know what to do. Like a lot of agencies now, sometimes boards are really engaged and, a force behind the CEO. But in this case, the board were community leaders, but had really no guidance of what they were supposed to be doing, except, maybe connecting to some local fundraising or trying to help the CEO make decisions. But when there was no CEO for an extended period of time, it was just, a ship without a sail. And it was totally adrift. So we were at ground zero. And I think the point that I'm trying to make and why I chose this as an example is, as an SME for the last 4 years, I have been really all over the country. And people have different types of resources, and every state, every rural area has a little bit different culture and that sort of thing. But these folks had nothing. And we engaged with them and helped them really go through the transformation process. So no matter, where you are, the audience who are listening to you now, in terms of, well, I don't have that many resources, or, my community doesn't want us, or we don't have money, or blah, blah, blah. It's, these people have had close to nothing. And with, I believe, the right leadership, with the right goals, that's why I went through the waiver and WIOLA and employment first. What is it that you're trying to achieve? That is, regardless of where you are located, you've got to come to a group decision of what is our mission. And at St. John's in the 80s, we went through an exercise, and if some of you may have heard me speak before about how our larger organization went through the transformation process. And the very first thing we did is I was fortunate enough to have the luxury of having like 4-star generals on my board, having some real business leaders who sat me down. I was very young at the time. I was in my early 30s. And, I had a background as being a teacher and a both rehab person and doing technical assistance, but I had never run an agency before. And I didn't know how to do strategic planning. And what they did for me was we sat down every Friday for breakfast and discussed what our mission was from just a layman's standpoint, because a lot of these people didn't really have a background in running programs for people with intellectual disabilities. And we came up with our mission, pretty similar to the integrated community employment and integrated community engagement, or competitive employment. We came up with advancing community support and opportunities for people living with disabilities. After extended period of time of talking, of discussing, debating, we came to the conclusion that people with disabilities, if they're going to be independent, their learning environment really needs to be the community. This is where they need to learn skills to get that job, not in a segregated environment where they are practicing in a make-believe world. They need to be really part of the community, just like you or I, as we were growing up. That's how we've got the skills to have the jobs that we have today. And by putting people in segregated environments, there's a degree of social deprivation that is layered on top of whatever disability people have. And so let's get people out in the community and engaged and, practicing life skills in the real environment that they're going to live. So in looking at the assessment process, we realized we needed to change everything. That, we needed to get people into the community and away from the segregated environment. And we had pretty much every obstacle there was to face. They had poor funding, staff morale was low, there was no community engagement, their resources of the facilities were very small, they had no money. So, moving on to the next part. What did we do with all of this? Are we ready, Devin?
Yeah, go ahead.
We're going. Okay. So we actually had to redesign the entire business. We had to come up with a strategic plan. And a lot of this was, just stumbling through every day, trying to make things work. So our long-term goals here was we were going to convert this agency to be 100% community-based services. That we had to do a lot of advocacy with HUD and state PD office to create normalized living conditions and to increase the revenue stream. Short term, we thought we could probably use some of the facility assets to raise revenue. We were going to leverage, because they had ownership of 4 of these homes and the shelter workshop. That over the long term, we were going to either sell or repurpose facilities to manage the debt that they had. And one of the biggest things is we were going to have to find efficiency in the operation. We were going to have to do a lot of reallocation of various resources to move into the community. So it was going to be a real juggling act from day one. So, going back over to the 7 areas, a way to, outline, look at compartments of what kinds of change that we really needed to focus on. And so these are the 7 areas, and this is what we needed to do. So we really needed to start out with a communication plan, both internal and external. And as a larger agency, we did this also. But, starting brand new with an agency, and almost all the agencies I work with, regardless if they're rural or in big cities, what is your mission? What is your vision? What is your core values? You really got to come to something succinct. And, so many of us have, a paragraph or 2 of what our mission is. Like, we're going to cure the world. We're going to, people aren't going to have disabilities anymore. They're going to be independent and have, great lives. And a lot of our mission statements really don't make any sense to me. I had the luxury of 4-star generals that would say the mission. Every soldier needs to know what the mission is. What are they going to accomplish? Not how we view the world, that everybody's going to be independent and, have a fulfilling life and all that. At St. John's, our old mission was to operate a center for children with mental retardation to reach their greatest potential. And all of that was not productive. to operate a center, that's your mission, a building for children with mental retardation. That's the eternal child kind of syndrome. We were serving adults. To reach their greatest potential, that's meaningless. And so when we changed our mission to advancing community support and opportunities for people living with disabilities, every staff person, and when I left St. John's, we had 900 staff persons. Every staff person could say that mission. Every staff person knew what their role was every day that they went to work. They were to advance community support and opportunities. They were our ambassadors. They were helping people develop relationships in the community. So you've got to come to terms with that. Then you've got to come up with what your comparative advantage is. And for us, it was, well, we were founded in 1868. You know, we had staying power. We were a nonprofit with a long history. We had a volunteer board who were community leaders. We prided ourselves on the use of technology to create efficiencies, and our goal was to be 100% community-based services. So we came up with that comparative advantage of why we thought we were the very best program. And we had people practice that. That became our elevator speech. So every staff person, be it a manager or a direct service person, could say that. And so when we were out in the community and they were trying to get a job or just get a volunteer site or do some education, recreation, when a community member asked, what are you doing or who are you? Everybody could say what the comparative advantage was, what the elevator speech was. We rebranded it. They had a name that was fairly long, and we were St. John's Community Services, and we wanted to have respect for this agency. So we came up with a hyphenated name for about a year and a half, and it slowly faded because we had St. John's, and their name was CDS. It was an acronym. And eventually that was so long, people just said St. John's. But by rebranding this small agency, people respected us. The old hardline community leaders who remembered CDS saw that we were honoring them still, and that it was still the same agency. We were just bringing in additional resources to make it better. And we came up with business practices. You know, if you look at your email, so many of you, and I did this too, you know, when you send an email, you'll have your name, you'll have Thomas Wiles, but you don't have your contact information under it. You don't have your cell phone information. Your logo looks like some kind of charity of, you know, some picture of a person with a disability who doesn't look like they're actually doing anything productive. They're hugging each other, or they're standing in line looking disabled. We came up with a way to answer the phone. Everybody answered the phone the same way. Every meeting had to have minutes, and people were designated to take minutes and taught to take minutes. We scheduled meetings routinely throughout. We created a communication system, was the first part. We began to have routine meeting schedules across the agency. We had the staff training in the elevator speech, and we had training in team problem solving. What we did was, and I'll probably talk about this later too, is we surveyed all of the staff. We had a survey instrument that looked at 7 different areas, like pay and benefits, supervision, morale, communication, training, those kind of things. And we asked the staff to rate each of those areas right at the beginning when we took this agency over. And it was really low scores. So what we do is we ask for volunteers, and we paid that staff to come in and go through a couple hours of training of how to do group problem solving, how to reach consensus. Then we said to them, look at the scores. What is the lowest scores here? We want you to pick what you think are the problem areas. And then as a team, we want you to reach consensus on how to make improvements in that area. We did that in all of our programs, and it increased staff morale until we were getting some of the highest scores actually possible in this rating system. We looked at best practices, and we began to send the staff to conferences. We gave them stipends. We gave them scholarships. And you're going to say, well, how did you fund all this? We don't have any resources. And, you know, every location is different, but, you know, kind of bottom line, we have fought every battle you can imagine there is to fight in 5 states prior to there being an employment first. And we had to fight with some state governments occasionally, and, you know, we had to beg, borrow, and steal money to come up with how, you know, do you do some of these things. But we'll talk about that. So we ended up with a communication plan. We increased the website, came up with electronic newsletters, and we had a variety of newsletters, some for the staff, some for the community. We would do it by email. For the 5 states we were in, I had one director of communication. One person did, you know, all of this, of setting up presentations at churches and social clubs, and being in the newspaper and doing newsletters, because we had come up with, you know, a mission, our core values. We had standards for taking pictures where we would only do printed, be electronic or hard copy, of people who were actively engaged in the community, being valued, contributing community members. You know, none of this standing in line looking disabled kind of stuff. So we had a print communication plan that we continuously looked at and updated all the time. We looked at the board, and we really didn't want to lose the board because they were good people, but we began to add to them. We added some parents of folks with disabilities. We added some other community leaders who were more advanced in their thinking. And we continued to educate the board and the community about all the best practices, about being in the community, about having jobs, about, you know, the benefits, kinds of counseling that could be had at that time. And this was early in the evolution of our field, moving to community-based programs. But every board meeting, you know, we would bring in somebody who would talk about the job that they just got, or their community experience, or we would bring in speakers who were, you know, from the university or from the government to talk about where the agency should be going. One of the challenges we had is that this radio station was feared by the board. There was a owner of this radio station, and I think they had about 6 different frequencies. And he was broadcasting over the 6 counties, and he would occasionally say something bad about the board, about how they were failing the community. So one of the first things we did, since this was such a feared entity, is I went and met the gentleman who was the owner, who everyone feared, and began to talk about the new vision that we saw for this agency, and got him all excited about, we want people to be full contributing members of the community, and, we're going to try to leverage some of its resources to make it financially stable. And so he put us on a talk show of a Sunday afternoon, right after church, and I got to talk to the entire community about the changes that were being had. And we won this gentleman over to where he ended up doing 2 major fundraisers for the agency every year, like $10,000 each. And he hired 2 of our people. So we, used, in this very rural area where, there was a little local paper that wasn't really disseminated across all these counties. So the radio station was really a way to connect to the community, which was fairly unique. And we took advantage of it and really won him over. We took the management agreement, and over time, we saw all the deficits and the assets, which were meager, and we proposed a merger after another year. We extended the management agreement so that we would have more time to make some changes. We knew we had to design the day program, the workshop, and residential, that the whole service delivery system needed to be changed. And that we needed to find efficiencies, we needed to diversify the funding, and we needed to really reallocate a lot of resources to make this work. For the efficiencies, where we started was they had secretaries, they had administrative assistants, they had several people doing actually one job where we could consolidate over time some of these positions. And for the most part, we really did not fire anybody. We told people what our vision was and where we were going. And during the time that the management agreement was going on, some of the folks started looking for other jobs. So we took advantage of them leaving and didn't refill those. Technology, because vehicles were a real problem, and that they were old vehicles and they weren't maintained and had a lot of debt, we went to enterprise. They have a corporate division, and we did this for all of St. John's. You go to them and you can lease vehicles. And over time, we started leasing vehicles for no more than 3 years. And with the lease, we would get a gas card and a maintenance program, to where when you filled up your tank using the gas card, you punched in the mileage. And so we would get a monthly printout of what routine maintenance was due at that time, and what local gas stations had the best prices to do it. So staff could then be dedicated, assigned to a vehicle to take care of that, where we would have a charge account, and no more ball tires, no more lack of oil changes. And they took trade-ins of all of our old vans and vehicles and gave us a good trade-in value for them. So we renewed that. And decentralization. What we started doing, and in the second segment, I know Dwayne is going to be talking about just how we did this, but it was not coming to the central location of 50 miles away. That over the long haul, we had to look at hooking people up their community in their county, and every county had at least a half a dozen or more of little towns. So what are the nonprofits there? What are the recreation, educational programs there so that people don't have to drive so far? And then matching staff who lived in those locations with participants who lived in those locations. So we cut down a lot of travel, which cut down a lot of costs, overtime driving and gas vehicle costs. We diversified our funding. That what we saw was that they weren't using all of the waiver codes available. You know, they were using like pre-vote, which was center-based, and they weren't using community-based waiver codes. And by shifting codes, we increased our funding, which also, allowed us to be in the community. We looked for private support, like the radio station was doing fundraising, and we did other kinds of fundraising. We did annual appeals. We had a database of all the community leaders and kept growing that. And then we began to tap into both rehab funding for people who were, employment bound, that we had another funding source. One of the very first things we did was I went to the local bank in Martin, Tennessee, and developed a relationship with the local president of the bank and explained the situation, explained how we were trying to do something uniquely different, that we were going to honor the agency, we were going to help it become financially stable. And what he did was give us a major loan with our group homes as collateral that we would pay back over time as we moved out of these larger group homes and converted to waiver homes, that we could sell or do something different with these homes to pay back the loan. So that was one of the very first new funding streams we had to pay off some of the debt, to give staff a routine paycheck. Within a year, we were able to give staff raises and benefits because we had this new influx of money coming from a whole variety of sources, as well as we reduced our expenses considerably, and we started moving into technology a lot. Going back to technology, not only did we use Enterprise, but we started using Therac, and staff, could do, after we provided a lot of computer training, they could do their data recording in the field or at home or at the local coffee shop. We had a time and attendance system where people could call in and it would record their time, starting work, ending work. It was part of ADP financial management system that interfaced with payroll and the entire accounting system. So for our 5-state operation, we had a very minimum home office because we relied so much on technology, and because we had such fewer staff compared to other agencies, it paid for the technology. So technology is a big cost saver and an efficiency that will make life a lot better in so many ways. So for the workforce, we stabilized their pay and increased their benefits. We reorganized. We put in a CEO for that operation who was from that state. We had a program manager from that part of the state who operated, oversaw the Martin, Tennessee operations. We created new job descriptions for everybody that really focused on relationship building, being in the community, creating opportunities for people who knew the community. So as there was turnover and we developed our pilot positions, those are the people that we selected, be they prior staff or new staff that were coming in. For our pilot programs, we started out with who was the willing and the able. We just didn't make anybody do anything about the community. We said, who wants to go on a brand new adventure to our direct service staff? Who wants to be our ambassadors to the community and help people have community engagement, with the idea that that community engagement will lead to competitive community employment, integrated employment. So we started looking at people who were creative, who were relationship driven, and started looking for people who were team players. Often folks in sheltered workshops really haven't had the opportunity to practice those kinds of skills because it's a production line, and their mission is to, crank out so many items a day. So, this is a different skill set that we were asking of our staff. We took them through orientation and training, just a handful of people, the willing and the able, who had those skills or interests. We had a community manual, and that we have available. It's a boilerplate manual of what to do in the community, what to do if something unusual happens or bad happens. How do you communicate to community members? We've got this boilerplate, and at the end you'll see my contact information. If anybody wants it, just send me an email and I'll send it to you. We worked with the staff who were part of the pilot on what the communication plan was so that they knew how we were talking to people. And as I was telling you, we did these staff surveys so that we used direct service staff to help us improve our service and have a vested interest in the changes that were occurring. So everybody was on board. For customers, we started doing person-centered planning. Of course, we had to train a lot of people on how to do that, but we started. The parents were involved in the development, revision, editing of our community manual. We also had the willing and able for the pilot from the customer standpoint, who wanted to be in the community, who wanted to get a job. And we got about 3 people in a group who made sense, who were a cohesive group that had similar interests. We made sure that they were part of the communication plan. When they went out in the community, we took pictures of them being successful, of having fun. They would come back just like staff to the center initially, and they would be excited. And they would tell the other staff, and they would tell the other participants what fun they had and how exciting this was. And we started to sell. That was part of our communication plan of we didn't have to make our participants, our staff do anything. That, members of their own sold the rest of the crowd that this was a much better line of service, more fun to do than being in a building in 4 walls all day. So what we also did, what a lot of people don't do, is have individual budgets. That the workshop needed an individual budget, the day program needed an individual budget, the homes need individual budgets. But I have found as an SME, a lot of smaller agencies don't do individual budgets. And so they don't know what programs are the winners or the losers, or where you have to focus on your efficiencies. So for the first time in years and years, we developed individual budgets for all of these programs. We brought in a centralized quality assurance, and that was people within the program started monitoring themselves, that they took turns surveying other programs, like the day program might survey the workshop program, or residential might survey another program, so that people had a vested interest and they knew what quality was. We went for CARP certification. We were the first and perhaps the only program to date that we had all 5 of our states certified simultaneously by CARP. We had close to 100 people on the phone in our exit interview. And we had changed not just this program, but all our programs where we didn't even receive one recommendation. That they said that we were the very first program that they had been to, and there had to be like over 20, 30 CARF surveyors that came out simultaneously to all 5 state locations. They said that we were the first program that walked the talk of totally community-based services. So, and we instituted the technology. We did the enterprise car thing. We did the time and attendance. We did TheraAb. We did centralized and computerized billing. And we did ADP for HR and accounting. We had, for the results, internal management teams where, we followed up on our own surveys, our state quality teams, and strategic planning. We consciously moved from being a charity to, you've got to rethink your entire business, that you are no longer a charity, you are an employment placement business where you're giving people community day opportunities, either recreation, education, volunteering opportunities, so that you can do a discovery process to see what interests, what skills, what emerging skills people have, so that you can make a really good employment match. So you don't burn bridges with the few employers that you might have available to you, that this is going to be a good match. I've been to some providers who, I found Johnny a job, and it's 15 miles from where he lives. This is doomed to failure, that, people make reckless matches. But by, giving people the community engagement as perhaps the first priority to moving to the whole employment first initiative, you can make matches so much more efficiently and successfully. And we moved residents to waiver funded for the group homes. We began to move, people who were in 8 to 10 beds. We had to really go to war with HUD to make this happen, and had to really go to war with the DD agency because they didn't want to spend the money. So we went through some due process exercises where parents and participants said, I want to live in the community. I want to be connected to my community. And so we started moving people into the community, and we did start selling the homes or repurposing the homes over time. So, and the initial outcome within 2 years, with minimum resources from the parent agency, that was in DC. My board that I had in DC was very, I don't want to use the word opposed, but reluctant to take on this agency that was having so many problems. So I really did have to maneuver to use the resources that was within the agency by reallocation, by using the group homes as collateral, by finding efficiencies, by collapsing job descriptions, that after 2 years, we had half of the day participants moved into employment or in integrated community opportunities, that half of the residents had moved into town, into 3-bed community-based waiver homes, that we ended up with a balanced budget. Well, we actually had a budget. Prior to us coming in, there was no budget. They just spent money they had, and they owed money they didn't have. And we repaid most of all of the community bills. So we increased the waiver funding by using both rehab and some new waiver codes. We decreased administrative costs. We sold one home and paid back the bank. And we won community support through our community communication plan, through the vested interest that we created by truly involving and educating the board, the staff, working with the university for some placements, some volunteer and education stuff, and working with the bank. And the radio station was really the first best thing that we achieved. We cut travel time and expenses in the transportation process and tremendously increased safety. I could sleep at night knowing that some van wasn't broken down in the middle of nowhere in a snowstorm. Increased staff morale, and we measured it by using our survey. And by using all the efficiencies and reallocation, we increased salaries and benefits. We decreased staff turnover and tremendously decreased staff overtime. And that was one of the big killers, that even though that they were budgeting people at 29 hours and not giving them staff benefits, they were incurring so much overtime in transportation that our technology and efficiencies were incredible. And over that period of time, by the time we got to year 3, we merged with St. John's, and we ended up dropping the name of that agency. And in kind of a natural evolution, that the name was actually too long, even though it showed respect and stuff, that everybody called it St. John's. So that slowly but surely, we just started changing all the signage and the letterhead just to say St. John's. So that's my contact information. This is my story. If anybody wants the community manual, or if you have other thoughts later on, you can email me. Dwayne Webb, for the second rural webinar, was or is the day program manager. And the hope is that Dwayne is going to take you much deeper into the story now that you've got a background of where this agency came from and what challenges we face and what we were able to achieve. Dwayne is going to talk to you about just how did he do, and Dwayne was really the spearhead for this, make the community connections, find the opportunities, how he decentralized the participants as well as the staff, more from the program management level. Pretty much what I have presented to you is more from the board, the CEO, the 5,000-foot view of what's really possible. So when I go into a rural program now, which I often do, I am so many more times in down backcountry roads to small, isolated agencies that they can do this. And I'm watching them convert routinely by finding efficiencies, technology, and more than anything, you know, the mission, deciding clearly what you want to accomplish. Most often when I am providing technical assistance to agencies who seem to be floundering, especially for an extended period of time, they have never come to a consensus between the management and the board about where is this agency really going. You know, if you're going to be in the community, you can't continue funding the workshop. You know, you need to find how to phase that out. And in this process, what I hope I've shared with you is you really don't focus on shutting down the workshop because people are making money. You know, you're focusing on how do I get people into the community where they'll enjoy it, that they'll see this as a better alternative. And when the time comes, you know, they could be still in the workshop and be in community engagement activities until you find the perfect match for an employment opportunity. And then they're really not giving up anything in the workshop. And the workshop will eventually fade on its own weight. So that's the presentation. Do we have any questions, Devin?
There's a couple questions, but we're pretty much out of time. And I think Dwayne will probably answer the questions in the next webinar anyway.
Okay.
But I'll forward those on to Dwayne, and maybe we can start with those next time if he doesn't already include those in his presentation.
Right. So Dwayne will take you all to the next step.
Right. There's a question around transportation, and then a question around individuals that require more care, for example, medical or behavioral challenges, and where to go in that rural setting with those issues. So I think that might be a good segue into Dwayne's.
Yeah, give him a heads up and he'll be prepared because we had all of those issues and he was able to address them.
Right. But thank you very much, and I will send out the PowerPoint slides when I send out the evaluation survey. So look for those if in the next day or so for all of the participants. So thanks again, Tom.
And if anybody needs any resources or has any other questions too, just email me at that address.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you.